Diaphanous, a Gothic short story. They saw them everywhere. Almost every villager had a story in which either they themselves or someone they knew had seen them. Recently or several years ago, it no longer mattered. These were stories you could rely on, so widespread were they. Just a few minutes ago, Mary Thompson, the plump innkeeper, always inquisitive but otherwise sweet-hearted, had seen one herself while serving Father Jackson his daily portion of coffee and biscuits. He stood by the inn's doorway without stepping across the threshold. This boy must have been no more than 12 years old. He stood motionless, with his big eyes wide open, curiously fixed on the scene with the priest and Mary Thompson. He wore black cloth shorts, with wide suspenders drawn over a thin white cotton shirt, with short sleeves and dark brown buttons. To complete this outdated outfit, he had stuffed on his head a wide-brimmed felt hat, also black. He looked dusty and old, without being dirty. "Do you need something, child?" asked Mary Thompson, stopping with the tin kettle suspended mid-air above the coffee cup. "Are you hungry? Would you like a biscuit? It doesn't cost anything," she continued warmly, eliciting a few grimaces of displeasure on the faces of 2 or 3 inn patrons who had never before heard such an offer from her. The boy remained motionless, his gaze just as fixed as before. His large black pupils seemed to encompass and pierce every corner and individual present in the inn's high-ceilinged room, filled with smoke and the steaming scent of coffee and age. From behind the innkeeper, Mr. Thompson, the blacksmith, repeated, in a well-meaning but gruff, uncontrolled tone, "Come on, boy. Why are you standing there not saying anything? Do you want a biscuit?" Well, that moment jolted Mary Thompson from her warm, friendly mood at once, and, turning toward her crude husband, coffee churning violently in the pot, she began to berate him sharply, heedless of any onlookers. Reverend Jackson waited politely for 2 or 3 insults to be hurled, and then intervened. "Mary, be a dear. You've left me with half a cup of coffee and still no biscuit. And here I am, paying for it." Annoyed but not surprised, Mary Thompson apologized, topped off the preacher's coffee cup without enthusiasm, and brought him the small plate of biscuits. Leaving him to his daily ritual of dunking biscuits in coffee, the innkeeper quickly cast her eyes toward the door. "Well, he's gone," to her husband. "Of course you had to butt in." Then to Reverend Jackson and the others present. "How, Lord forgive me, does he always leave? I never get to talk to him. Did any of them say anything?" "That little girl I saw a year ago didn't tell me anything," the priest replied, uninterested in the topic, sipping his coffee and smacking his lips with relish. "She was just standing there in the churchyard on a small mound of earth, next to Mrs. Charlotte Oliver's grave. Poor woman, she died young." He gathered a few crumbs that had fallen on the counter with his stubby fingers and popped them into his mouth. "Anyway," he said, licking his fingertips, "it was a curious moment. I called out to the child to ask who she was, since I'd never seen her in the village before. But she didn't answer and didn't look at me at all. She must have been about 5 or 6, I think. She was just standing there, with her little hands on her knees, and didn't even lift her head to look at me. She had on a white dress, a bit dirty, it seemed. I thought perhaps a new family had come to the village, so I left her alone. But then I saw her again a few minutes later, apparently picking flowers on the church hill. That's all. I didn't see any others. But I've heard plenty of stories." To the others in the inn, "Maybe you know better. Maybe one of you talked to one of them or found out whose kids these are." Silence for a moment, and then Mr. Pritchard, the cobbler, spoke in an almost faint voice. I haven't seen one with my own eyes, but my grandparents told me they came face to face with one of those little boys about 20 years ago. They said the little one didn't seem older than 3. He was fastening the buckle of his little leather shoes on their porch. Grandma saw him through the window. She called out to him to wait a little, that she'd bring a cloth to wipe them down, as they were very dusty, like he'd been walking through dirt quite a bit. Where would a 3-year-old kidling go by himself? Anyway, he raised the glass of brandy he was holding leisurely in his hand, swirling the liquid as if it were some grand potion. By the time Grandma went out, the boy had disappeared. He downed the strong drink in one gulp. Silence again. Everyone seemed lost in thought, and Henry Bennett, the young journalist newly arrived in the village precisely to get to the bottom of the story, feared they'd quickly change the subject and return to their mundane activities. So he jumped in at once with his notebook and pencil in hand and asked, "Don't you find it curious that in this village, for decades, children keep appearing here and there, ones nobody has heard of, whose parents no one knows, who refuse to answer even the simplest of questions? What's their name, where they're from, whose children they are? And no one, for at least 2 generations, has been interested enough to get to the bottom of this issue." "Who's this now?" asked Jenkins the baker, not to anyone in particular, just to the whole room. Mary Thompson had noticed him when he came in and had served him earlier, but she had been so busy that she hadn't yet had a chance to poke and pry and find out who he was and where he came from. "We might have taken you for one of those children," she said with unintentional humor. "But I fear your age gives you away. The children, no matter who you ask, never seem to be older than 14. And she was right. The innkeeper. Henry Bennett stood out in the village, not just because of his age, he was just a little over 20, but also for his elegant attire and intelligent gaze, and especially because of that damned notebook he kept in plain sight. A young, ambitious journalist from the city, and handsome to boot, with black, glossy hair delicately parted to one side, freshly shaven cheek, and youthful skin. Alert, attentive, and above all, calm and gallant, Henry had used his charm countless times to persuade anyone to answer his questions whenever he was working on a new article. And he only worked on articles that directly interested him, on topics that fascinated or gnawed at him personally, no matter how much the people from the city newspaper paid for him. Truth be told, he didn't even need the money. He was the son of a renowned lawyer and lacked for nothing. And now this pampered darling of the universe had chosen to step off the train in Mary Thompson's village, unofficial leader. Yet somehow everything that happened in the locality wove itself into the history of her inn, and to settle, once and for all, more so he could sleep soundly from now on. This curious matter he'd learned about 2 weeks earlier. "Ah," Henry Bennett cut in. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Henry Bennett, son of the lawyer Andrew Bennett. Many of you know him because he's represented numerous workers from here in various legal matters. That's actually how I learned about the issue with the children. Mrs. Whitaker, Lady Whitaker, I should say, told us 2 weeks ago, over dinner, about the curious happenings in your village." "Lady Whitaker," interrupted Reverend Jackson. "What an extraordinary woman. Such a pity about her husband, poor man, died last year. Since then, I'm afraid, Lady Whitaker has given herself to some less than Christian activities. Loss and grief can do that to a person. Well, I won't go into details. Lady Whitaker," Henry Bennett continued firmly, "is one of the most rational and educated people I know. And she has an extraordinary heart. That's why she told us about the children. She keeps a journal about the matter and has spoken with many people in the village. That's how I learned that over the past 20 years, 12 such children have been seen by various locals and visitors. A murmur of surprise passed like a shiver through the room among all those present, perhaps about 15 people, at the hearing of the number of children seen in the village whose origins were unknown. 13 now, said Henry Bennett, if we count the boy from earlier. 13 children who appear in the village out of nowhere and at unexpected times, without any of you, your parents or your grandparents, being able to figure out who they are, where they come from, and perhaps what they want. They don't want anything, Mr. Thompson interrupted, again abruptly and out of place. People keep asking them. They don't want anything. They don't say anything. How the hell are we supposed to know where they come from? And has no one ever thought, my dears, to go from house to house and ask, in the nearby villages perhaps, or through the surrounding forests? Maybe the children belong to some group that wanders about. The journalist posed the key question. Everyone, wide-eyed. It was a good question, and many had no idea how to answer it. Mr. Pritchard, with newfound courage fueled by brandy, said confidently, about 15 years ago, the men from the village went to find out where these kids keep coming from. They went from house to house, wherever doors were open to search, through the forest, and they asked in the neighboring villages. Nothing. No one had seen them there, and our folks didn't spot them during the search here. Otherwise, it's not even worth investigating, because for all these years we've all been working the lands around the village, and we would have noticed if anyone had been occupying our properties. He gestured to Mary Thompson, tapping his finger on the glass. Another one. Henry Bennett took notes with his head bent too close to the notebook on the table. He wrote firmly, afraid the pencil marks might fade and he'd be left without any information. These kids always leave, no matter where they're seen. Has no one noticed which way they go? Either where they're headed or where they come from. Has no one seen them coming, he asked, without addressing anyone in particular. No one, said the Reverend rather definitively. I'd say what everyone's saying, Mr. Pritchard interrupted again, downing the freshly brought glass. But I'm afraid the priest won't let me into services anymore. Come now, don't say some unchristian nonsense, the Reverend replied promptly. Those are superstitions, or, worse yet, the devil's witchcraft. Well, that's exactly what it's about. The devil, young Mr. Bennett, the cobbler continued. Go on, the journalist urged, much to the eternal disapproval of Reverend Jackson. Well, that's the answer, sir. All these children are the devil, each time in a different form. He comes to see what we're up to. Laughter, smacking lips and disapproving huffs suddenly erupted throughout the room. Some made the sign of the cross and spat beside their chairs. Mary Thompson kept her expression solemn, serious, weighing Mr. Pritchard's words. You don't mess around with such things. The devil, Henry Bennett repeated. Do you believe the devil has taken the form of children who fasten the buckle of their shoes on an old couple's porch, who stand quietly by the graves of people in the village, who come to the inn's door and, with curiosity, watch what's happening inside? Children who, hold on, he flipped through a few pages of his notebook, who play hopscotch in the street with other village kids, without saying a word and hopping through the squares just once, who stand in the service at the back row and leave first before the other parishioners notice them. These are the devil? He flipped another page. Or perhaps the one Mrs. Eldridge swears she saw peering through the window when the family was celebrating Christmas in a spectacularly cold winter, Or maybe the little girl who was followed by Miss Evans's dog from the bakery around the street corner, only for the animal to return alone moments later, somewhat bewildered, to Miss Evans. These are the devil, Mr. Pritchard? I doubt it, and I'll prove it to you tonight. Everyone in the inn turned toward him, not just with their faces, but with their chairs, too. They hadn't heard anything like this before. Someone trying to prove anything about those children. Truth be told, none of them could even prove the kidlings existed. Many were lucky the children had appeared before groups like the one in the room downstairs at the inn. Otherwise, if they'd encountered one of those kids while walking alone on the road or tending to the animals, not a chance in hell anyone would have believed them. They might have even ended up in the Institute for Nervous Disorders. But now Henry Bennett was saying he was going to prove... What? I won't give you details, my dears. Trade secrets, he laughed, somewhat embarrassed, realizing his impulsive declaration earlier might not have been the wisest move. But I guarantee you, there he went again, that I'll do everything possible tonight to find out where the children, who keep appearing in the village for the past 20 years, come from. I'm convinced that searching in the evening and at night will yield better results than searching in the middle of the day. Think about it. It's clear that these children, as well as their parents or guardians, are skilled at hiding and slipping away, especially during the day. They blend into the crowd, the noise, into the activities you all go about every day. But in the evening, at night, they have to go somewhere to rest, to make a fire, to keep warm or cook. The evening is the answer, my dears, and no one has searched for them in the evening. True, came the faint and solitary support from Mr. Pritchard. I invite you to come with me, and I will prove to you where these children live. We will settle today, once and for all, this mystery of the village. Who's coming with me? Silence. Come on, have some courage. Doesn't anyone want to see the answer with their own eyes? Henry Bennett continued, now more frightened than embarrassed, but a fear born from a city ego bruised by a rural crowd. I'm not coming. We haven't searched at night for 20 years. Why would we start now? Said Mr. Pritchard, who for several minutes seemed to be the journalist's only engaged audience. Besides, if it's the devil, who'd want to come face to face with him at night? Everyone in the room again made the sign of the cross and spat beside their chairs. It seemed that the devil theory had more supporters than Henry Bennett had initially thought. Reverend Jackson rose from his chair, paid his bill, lightly tapped his hat in greeting to the journalist and the rest of the room, and left. 3 or 4 others followed him. Mary Thompson clarified to the young newcomer, "At noon, when the Reverend leaves, it's a sign that break time is over for everyone. They're going back to work." Henry Bennett followed them with his eyes. No one seemed to pay attention to him anymore. They almost treated him with a certain caution, like a mentally unstable person you neither blast nor encourage in their madness. Mr. Pritchard didn't leave, but he was staring intently into his glass, clearly avoiding meeting his gaze again. "Come now, don't be upset, Mr. Bennett," Mary Thompson said tenderly. "Come have some rabbit stew, a real treat, and until tonight you can think it over." The stew had indeed been very tasty, but that didn't make young Henry Bennett give up on his plans for the evening, and night if need be. He got a map of the village from the innkeeper, marked all the places where the 13 children had been seen, and considered where he might start his search. At 10 o'clock he was on his feet and dressed, ready to go out into the cool village air. It was already September. He descended from his room to the inn's main hall, where Mary Thompson, still awake and serving the last customers, greeted him with a slightly disappointed look that said, more than anything, be careful. Henry stepped outside into the sharp evening air. By 12:30, he was ready to give up. He had been everywhere. He had checked almost every house and outbuildings, just in case someone was hiding those children, somewhere in stables or barns without the other villagers noticing. He had been to the merchant's stalls, the church, the school. He had searched at Jenkins' bakery, Mr. Thompson's smithy, and even Mr. Pritchard's cobbler shop. No one was spared his suspicion. He had looked under bridges, at the watermill, taken the main roads and bylanes, gazed toward the nearby hills and meadows. Nothing. It had all been in vain. Disappointed and utterly frustrated, and unwilling to return to the inn for fear of running straight into Mrs. Thompson and having to admit his shameful defeat in the dead of night, Henry Bennett decided to continue his midnight wanderings aimlessly along a narrow path that led out of the village to God knows where. It was better not to know where he was going and to see no trace of civilized life on the horizon. He even considered running away and never returning to this village, of letting it all slip into oblivion as some youthful folly, but all his belongings were still at the inn, so he set that plan aside for the moment. The farther he got from the village, the more he seemed to shed the feeling of shame, and could enjoy the walk and the beautiful September weather. Cool, clear, soothing. The moon brightly lit the gravel path and the tall wild vegetation along its edges. It didn't seem like many people passed through there. In fact, Henry hadn't seen a single boot print or cartwheel mark. He swung about aimlessly, now and then striking left or right with the stick he'd taken to fend off dogs, hitting dry hazel twigs or the brittle brown weeds, or kicking a stone far off. Otherwise, nothing. Silence. Too much silence, even. But Henry wasn't complaining. He liked being alone with his thoughts, breathing in the cold air deeply through his nostrils, and going wherever his feet took him. He went on like that for perhaps 2 kilometers. Looking back, the village barely appeared to him anymore as a bluish-gray silhouette in the night. He could see the light from the inn and, the young man thought, from Mr. Pritchard's cobbler shop. Hard-working folks, these people, he said to himself, and continued walking along the path. A swing of the stick to the left, a swing of the stick to the right, along the path that seemed to keep narrowing between the old trees and withered weeds. At one point, he felt the stick strike something hard on the right side of the path, almost rocky. Looking more closely, he noticed an old boundary stone, covered in green moss and tangled with branches and grass. Henry tried to figure out what this stone marked and whether it still held any meaning after so long out of sight. Swinging the stick forcefully through the shrubs and weeds, he eventually came upon a clearer spot, less covered by the greedy vegetation. "It's a trail," he said, astonished out loud, as if sharing the discovery with someone that was with him. A few hefty additional strikes later, as if with a bayonet, and Henry managed to make his way through the tangle of branches and twigs, stepping eagerly onto the newly found trail. He scratched his hands and face, but within a few meters he emerged from the thicket and discovered with surprise and satisfaction that from a certain point onward the path opened into a small grove, and he continued walking along it. The thick canopies of the old trees had somewhat darkened his path, but Henry was guided by courage and curiosity, and nothing could stop him from seeing where this side trail led, a path that had once been useful to someone, but was now trodden by no one. "I wonder how long has it been since anyone walked here," he pondered, and stepped forward with even greater enthusiasm. It couldn't have been more than 500 meters since he'd left the road coming from the village, and Henry noticed a brighter light in the distance, a sign that the forest opened into a clearing or meadow, where the moon could once again be seen freely, large, high in the sky. He was right. The closer he got, the clearer it became that from the rows of trees, one emerged into a meadow with tall grass, almost still green. Likely the coolness of the forest had kept the vegetation fresh for longer. A couple of more steps and he'd be there. The young man tread carefully through the still dark area, watching attentively where he placed his foot, and feeling a certain childish delight at the sound of leaves crunching under his heel. He had arrived. He was at the edge of the meadow. With joy, the young journalist let go of controlling his steps and was ready to bound through the dark green grass, like the ending of an adventure. At least now he'd have something to tell the villagers upon his return. But the night had other plans for him. As he passed the last row of trees and looked toward the promised meadow, Henry froze. In the hazy yellowish-blue light, yet somehow now far brighter than it had ever been that night, the ruins of old stones, like those of a cemetery, rose from the almost steaming ground. Simple, too small to bear inscriptions, covered in thick moss at the base and sparser toward the tops, as if someone had tried to save them from oblivion. And beside them, Henry nearly screamed, beside them, the diaphanous, bluish-green shadows of children. Many, more than 10, he thought, lacking the mental clarity to count them. Diaphanous children, moving to and fro as if in a little village of their own, among the graves. Whose? Breathing heavily and struggling not to faint, Henry restrained himself from making his presence known. He didn't know who, or rather, what, he was dealing with. In this state of stupor, he watched as a little girl, who couldn't have been more than 3, in a white ruffled dress, far too thin for this weather, with short little socks and white little shoes, rose from beside a small grave and ran quickly toward another, slightly larger one, where another girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, dressed the same, was waiting for her with open arms, so they could sit together and comfort each other through the night. A little farther on, about 3 boys who didn't seem to be older than 10 sat talking on the path between a few other graves. Farther still, on a small hill, there were more children, and still more toward the other side of the forest. They spoke without Henry being able to hear anything, played with imaginary objects, or embraced one another, awaiting the morning. His stupor turned into a profound sorrow, a sadness he felt viscerally, though he didn't know exactly to whom to address it. The impulse was to run toward the children and embrace them, to tell them that he didn't know why, but he mourned them. But he stopped. Somehow he knew he mustn't disturb their peace. Just as he thought these things, the 3-year-old girl turned her head toward him and for a second seemed to see him. Henry flinched and let out a gasp. The girl turned back to her friend, and the two continued their comforting companionship. The other children remained in their own world with their nocturnal activities. Henry couldn't bear it any longer. He resolved to leave as quickly as possible. With tears in his eyes, he looked once more at the tormenting bluish scene under the moonlight, sighed again for those diaphanous children, and turned on his heels back toward the forest. On his first step, he tripped badly in the tangled grass and fell softly onto the damp earth. Looking closer, right beside his now scraped hands, was a large rectangular slab, also covered in thick moss at the base. Henry quickly brushed aside the leaves and grass from the old stone and thought he glimpsed an inscription. Yes, there's something written here, he said to himself, and continued like a madman to scrape the moss off the carved writing. A few moments later, everything became clear. The moon warmly lit the almost lost writing on the stone. St. Agnes's Orphan Cemetery.